Well, Derek, we are hearing the subpoenas have been handed out in recent weeks to multiple people connected to former President Donald Trump's 2020 campaign. Arizona Attorney General Chris Mays has mainly focused her investigation on the 11 so-called fake electors from our state. We've told you about these fake electors before. On December 14th of 2020, they convened at the Arizona Republican Party headquarters here in Phoenix. They were allegedly preparing to sign documents claiming they were the legitimate representatives of the state's electoral votes. At that point, President Joe Biden had won Arizona by fewer than 11,000 votes, and the results had already been certified by Republican Governor Doug Ducey. But in the weeks that followed, some of the fake electors continued to push for then Vice President Mike Pence to reject the legitimate Democratic slate of electors. Now, according to sources, state prosecutors have asked witnesses about meetings attended by Trump where the fake elector plan was mentioned. There's no word exactly on who will be subpoenaed and whether or not that includes lawmakers, nor is there a timeline on when these subpoenas will come down. But as soon as we get that information, we will keep you informed. Nicole?
Vanessa.